Welcome to Code Dependent. We're delighted to have Madhumita Murgia with us today to discuss what it means to be human in a world that is rapidly changing thanks to the development of artificial intelligence. Now, before we get started, some housekeeping. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on the OII's website following the event. We will have a short sort of introduction from Madhu on the book, and then we will do probably 20 minutes of Q&A between me and her. And then it's time for you to ask questions and for all the people online to throw their questions at Madhu and what they want to know. If you're joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A box, and those in the room, save your questions for the end of the talk. And while I don't expect this to happen, please be civilized in the things you ask. So a warning, I will not tolerate any heckling. And if anyone engages in this, I don't think so, I will have to escort you out of the room.
Who's ever done these?
Well, you never know.
Me before.
We will find out. But yeah, now we have this out of the way. Some brief introductions. I'm Felix Simon. I'm a default student at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I look at AI in a news context. So I study how news organizations use artificial intelligence and what that means for the kind of stuff that ends up on our phones. And it's my super great pleasure to welcome Madhumita Murgia to the OII or the State Business School tonight. She is the first artificial intelligence editor of the Financial Times in London and has been writing about AI for quite a long time at this point.
10 years.
Blimey. So yeah, we've got a wonderful speaker with a wonderful and very interesting book. And with that, I hand over to you, Madhu.
Thank you so much for being here. And just so you know, this is the first time I'm talking publicly about my book, so very much a novice at this particular thing. So I would love your questions on not just about the book, but my day job is to report on AI for the FT and to kind of shape our global coverage. So I'm very happy to talk about things outside of the remit of this book. And as I said, I'm only used to asking the questions, so I'm probably going to tell you more than I should. Very happy to do that. So there are lots of ways to begin a story or a book. And that's one of the hardest things to do as a writer. And for me, this book was probably bubbling away since I first started writing about AI back when I was at Wired magazine. And you'll have this little pamphlet here, which is the introduction to the book. And it tells you a little bit about how I first fell into that rabbit hole of trying to understand the data economy of the internet and how that later led me to AI. And writing about companies like DeepMind, even before or at the time it was acquired by Google. But I think that for me, there was maybe one person who kicked off this book for me that made me want to write this. And his name was Carl Rissenek. So you probably won't recognize his name or know him. He is a scientist, a computer scientist, based in North Carolina. And he was one of the first people to develop computer vision algorithms. This was for the US Navy to recognize and see objects. And he was doing this, at a time when the technology was nowhere near as good as it was. He said there was like 1% improvement every year. They were trying to navigate submarines using his technology. It was slow going. And so he has seen how that huge jump has happened. And when we talked, it was because he had built some of the earliest facial recognition algorithms. And one of his algorithms had been used to recognize Whitey Bulger, who is a criminal in the US who had been hiding in LA for decades. And his technology was able to age this picture of Whitey Bulger, and then they found him in LA. So, so he was kind of one of the pioneers of this. The other thing about him was that he is African-American. He's biracial, but he identifies as being Black. And for him, he always kind of saw this through the eyes of a computer scientist, how he was developing these technologies that was gonna identify lost children or find criminals and kind of help police to do good. But in his lifetime of his work, because of how the technology really jumped into being so accurate, so powerful that it was able to recognize individual faces, it started to be used for something quite different to what he had imagined when he started developing these systems in the 80s. And so when we spoke, it was under kind of these circumstances where he'd developed computer vision systems to find out if somebody had undergone a gender transition. So he'd got this YouTube data set of people who had been posting about their transitions when they were taking hormone therapy. And he was trying to figure out, can we tell, can we still identify a person when they've transitioned gender? And he thought, again, this was a very academic question, but there was huge pushback when people discovered this online, because obviously those videos were posted for very different reason, as a kind of personal diaries or kind of people's experiences to support others and so on, and they felt very violated by it. So when we were talking, it was about this coming together of the technological and the sort of impact on humans, the social and political impact. And I say this in my book, for the first time ever, I heard a computer scientist tell me that they had serious moral doubts about what they had done with their lives, and whether they should have ever built this thing, and that they were scared about where it was going to end up. And also, ironically, that it was being used to target people who looked exactly like him, when it came to policing, and how, as you probably all know here, facial recognition has biases, which means it's far more inaccurate at identifying people of darker skin, and also female faces as well. And he never thought that would be sort of an actual social problem that he would confront in his time, but here it was. And for me, that was just like a moment of kind of considering how much, AI and technology more broadly has moved from just being sort of within computer scientists' labs and about code, into kind of impacting the rest of us in real time, and how it can happen in such a short time. So the goal for me of this book was to find people who had encounters with AI systems, and they didn't always have to be the creators of them like Carl was, but who had these collisions with AI systems in their daily lives somehow, that had impacts and consequences, second order effects, that I could explore to understand better how society was changing. And Carl was one of the stories that I would want to use. And as you can see from his example, it's not, it's not black or white. It's not, this is a good or a bad thing. He still does the work. He still believes in the potential of the technology, but he also understands the sort of dangers and the harms that it could cause. And so the other kind of goal for the book was to write something with nuance, because everything that I was seeing in the reporting around this topic was very much these factions and groups of people who seemed to have completely differing views, and it felt like they could never come together on this. And I wanted to show that you can have the same person with different views within themselves. And so, of course, there's going to be a plurality and a nuance of the impact of this technology. And I wanted, through the stories, to show that nuance, and not to tell. So this whole book is a narrative-led book. And it's, Felix pointed this out, I'm not prescribing the answer to everything or telling you this is what the future looks like, but showing you, laying out what our present looks like. And through the second order consequences, through the ripple effects and the stories, if we ourselves can start to draw out some of the implications of what this means for us. So for my book, I traveled to 6 countries, because I thought it was crucial that it was a global, international book that went outside of the English-speaking West, because culture is so closely interconnected with any technology, especially when it's used to make decisions about social issues, whether that's criminal justice, healthcare, government services, our work, now creativity. So these are all of the issues and stories that I actually have throughout the book. And I encountered a range of people. I wasn't looking for a specific narrative to fit any arc. I was just looking for people who had interesting stories to tell about what happened when their lives collided with an AI system. But somehow, and maybe this is because I'm a journalist and I'm like an AI system, looking for patterns always, that my whole job is I talk to some small representation of people, but through that I can say, this is what I think is the bigger picture. These are the dots that I'm going to connect for you to tell you something more than just what the 5 people I quote in this story have told me, right? So for me, you know, the patterns that emerged were really that all of the people I had chosen happened to be from marginalized groups. And again, this was not done on purpose. There were refugees, tribal people from India, single immigrant mothers, ethnic racial minorities, gig workers who are often precarious, human rights activists in China. So each of the stories I've picked, these people happen to be in some ways marginalized. And through that, it kind of became clear to me how the impact of AI often was widening the inequalities that it was supposed to be closing, the gaps that it was supposed to be closing. And that this is kind of what has become clear to me over the course of writing this book. I'll end with just reading you the last paragraph of my introduction, which you have, just to give you a sense of who's in here. And then I'll hand over to Felix and we can have a discussion. But I'll just start here so to give us a jumping off point. By reflecting on the march of AI, we can start to address the imbalances in power and move towards redress. My hope is that the experiences of the people in this book will rouse us from our fears to take back our agency and self-respect. My chosen subjects on the surface had nothing in common. A doctor in rural India, a food delivery worker in Pittsburgh, an African-American engineer, an Iraqi refugee in Sofia, a British poet, an Argentinian bureaucrat, a single mother in Amsterdam, a Chinese activist in exile, and a priest in Rome. But as I tugged on those individual threads, they formed a coherent design, and you are in the center of it.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to your super, super interesting and fascinating book. I mean, there's so much here, it's almost impossible to unpack it all, and I will try my best to sort of pick out some themes. We had this conversation earlier when we met, when you were like, well, actually, one of the interesting things about writing a book is actually then seeing it through the eyes of other people. And I sort of gave you my reading of it, and I will share that with you as well at this point. Because basically, to me, it's sort of composed of three essential themes. First, it's a book about techno-solutionism, the idea that we can fix things with technology, how that runs into dead ends again and again and again with severe consequences for people. It's also, and it's so fitting with the AI fringe theme under which we are tonight. It's about people at the fringe, at least in their visibility, who are nevertheless crucial to AI in many ways. It's those contributing to AI out of sight, and those adversely affected by it, who are often, as you were saying, marginalized, less powerful, while the benefits sort of accrue to majority groups and those who are more privileged. And finally, it's a book about, at least to me, the question of if, how, and how much we can and want to delegate to essentially any technology, but in particular to one that learns and improves and comes closer to human abilities and surpasses us in some cases even. Call it sort of the rationalization versus human autonomy argument. So in many ways, the first question I have for you is sort of, was that something that emerged through finding these stories, or was it something you sort of went in with and were like, okay, I will look at sort of these things in the stories I report?
Yeah, it's funny because not that many people have read the book yet because it's not out. So it's been really interesting. I think I've spoken to every single person who's read my book so far, which is so fascinating for me. And one of the people who I spoke to, they said, "Oh, it's such a political book," and like I was really like surprised by that to begin with, because like I don't see myself as I think it's because I've been a journalist for 12 years or whatever, that I very, actively try and be objective, and I present facts, and I don't show an opinion in the things that I write. I try and be, I try and bring that objectivity to all my reporting. And I think that will come out in the book as well. But clearly that, the fact that people read this as a political book, it made me kind of think, and I realized that, yes, when I do talk about all of the stories in this book, when I talk about deep fake porn and women, ordinary women who find themselves suddenly online and in these extremely sort of violating videos, or when it comes to the refugees employed to do data labeling in Kenya and in Bulgaria that I spoke to. Those stories are political, but I didn't go into it with any ideas or notions about what I think is right and wrong. For me, it was spending as much time as I could. And the whole point was to go in and find out, what does it mean now to live in this world? Who is being affected? Who's being harmed? And what are the opportunities? And to kind of uncover that. So yeah, I think that you're right. Those are the themes that have come out of it, but it was definitely not what I went in with. For me, this was purely about, let's look at the humans in this story.
It's also interesting how some people interpret something as political, even though it isn't, because it was my sort of reading of the book that is sort of strongly political in the arguments it makes. It reports, and then of course you can draw your own conclusions about it, but it's kind of an very interesting critique or comment on it. Let's sort of dive a bit into the sort of techno-solutionism bit first. So your book in many ways is full of stories of humans, but it's also full of quite sad stories where we have AI systems failing bitterly and actively causing very severe misery for those people. And there's this one example of mother with sort of children in a sort of difficult position, and she ends up in sort of the crosshairs of this Dutch kind of social AI system, which basically has the idea at its base, as far as I understand it, to improve their lives, but actually makes it much, much worse. And it's kind of funny because with technology, we've seen so many times how purely technological solutions may be well intended, but still can actively fail. And we still seem to be making the same mistakes again. Why do you think that is happening? Why do you think that's happening again with AI as well?
I think I said at the beginning, I started out at Wired magazine in 2012, and the whole point of that publication was to be excited about technology. And that's the tradition that I grew up in as a journalist. It was my first job. So I too am very much a techno optimist, but I was constantly writing about flying cars, brain machine interfaces that meant you could think about. So I actually met a woman who had a brain machine implant that could move a robotic hand. She was paralyzed. Like, I saw amazing things, and so really and met amazing entrepreneurs who and I sort of believed in that spirit of technology can do good. And I think that what's happened since 2012, in the years that I've been writing about technology, is that because of how technology has spread into our lives and become so central, particularly social media and the products that are coming out of Silicon Valley, that's become optimism on steroids, and particularly in the Valley, I think there's a real sense of the only solution to all the world's problems is technology, and it's maybe been proven out in certain areas, and you can see the growth of these things, and there are with social media there are huge advantages alongside the disadvantages as well. And so I think it's just reinforced the belief that we can build things that's going to connect the world and fix everything, and I think that's why we're in this situation today. And not only do the builders of the technology believe it, there's also a concentration of power, which I've talked about in the book here. And with AI, again, that's even further concentrated, because these companies now have the data, they have the computing power, they have the money and the know-how and knowledge. And actually pretty much nobody else has to do with the technology itself has that. Not even researchers are able to kind of interrogate these things. So I think, so they've moved down this path. And I think meanwhile, the rest of the world has moved further away, as we've seen the sort of outcomes and impacts of Facebook in parts of the world like Myanmar and Philippines and Kenya and Ethiopia, what algorithms can do to fan hatred, and looking at what happened around elections, the fears. So I think people are just, there's been this divergence. And I said this at the beginning, where it feels like we can never agree on it. So I think, that you have the companies who really believe that AI is going to supercharge productivity, solve scientific problems, do all of this good. And then you have sort of the rest of us being like, okay, but what about, just the basic stuff that we need, like free and fair elections and like ability to buy a house and, all of the other stuff that we're struggling with.
So the basics would be nice to have.
Yeah. And a lot of the people in my book, are struggling even more fundamental things, like, they need jobs to put their kids through school. And so I think that, there needs to be a coming together of this. And I think this is why we're in this position where you have some people who think technology can solve everything and some who've completely lost faith in it.
What I really like about what you just said is basically you picked up on this sort of theme of the political economy of AI, the question of who gets what, and why. And that's also one of the themes I sort of saw in the stories you told about these people, and especially in the stories of those who work in the supply chain of AI. I mean, to us, it's many times we see a shiny model, we see a chatbot interface, and it looks marvelous and it can do wondrous things. But we kind of tend to forget that there's actually an entire chain of people, systems at the back of it making that function, making it work. What you call the sort of undervalued bedrock of the AI industry. Can you tell us a bit more about the stories of these people? I mean, you went to Kenya, you talked to data annotators. Can you give us a bit sort of an insight into their world and into a world we often don't see when we think of AI?
Yeah, sure. So I met the woman who founded Sama, which is it's an American company, but they outsource their services to Kenya and Uganda in 2019. And, you know, she had this, again, very techno-optimistic view of what, you know, of creating a company in Kenya that would give work to young, you know, digital natives who didn't have formal jobs, and that it would kind of, you know, pay back into the Kenyan economy. It would bring these people into the working world, and at the same time, it was kind of serving this need of labeling data. So I was really fascinated by what that looked like, who these people were, and so I went to Nairobi to meet some of them. And it's really interesting because there has been some reporting done about data labeling since. And I think a lot of it, Time Magazine in particular, has done some stuff. We've talked about content moderators where, you know, the general view is we are paying, you know, really low wages. Obviously, that's why people outsource to the developing world. And then you're building these algorithmic systems for sort of trillion-dollar companies. And in no way are the people that I met seeing any of the sort of value or benefit of what, you know, Tesla and Elon Musk are seeing. And for example, Tesla, I'm using that example because they do label data for Tesla, for example. But on the other hand, when I went there, so I spent time with I went into the office and saw a bunch of moderators, but I wanted to spend a bit more time in the homes of some of them as well. So I spent time with Ian Coley, who's at the start of my book. He was a young man, single, living in Kibera, which is a slum, the largest in Africa, which is in the center of Nairobi. And he was sharing with 6 other young boys. He'd never had a job. He dropped, you know, he'd finished school and couldn't afford to go to college. So he was essentially getting in a lot of trouble. And he kind of heard about Sama. He kind of knew how to use a computer. So he decided to get into this. And in the 2 years that I was speaking to him, and then when I went to see him, like, his life was just dramatically different. He was still in Kibera, but he was married. He had a baby. They had their own, you know, home in Kibera, you know, just so much more mature. He had an idea for the career that he wanted. He'd started taking IT classes on the side. He wanted to build his own business. Just a completely different person from the boy that I had met really 2 or 3 years previously. And I've seen, you know, with the 3 or 4 people that I met, I saw that dramatic change in their lives. Susan was one of the women I met. She had a child. She's a single mother. She was able to, her child was now going to school through doing this work. And, you know, there was just so much more confidence and empowerment from being part of this kind of industry and understanding what is AI and what companies are we working for, compared to sort of what she was doing before, was selling chapatis on the street in Nairobi. So I did see, you know, the real changes that were made to people's lives. But my kind of takeaway from that is that's not enough. It's not enough to say we gave somebody a job, we paid them money, and therefore they could get a house and send their child to school. That's just what any job does. That's kind of how money works. It's not like, you know, you're not doing somebody a favor, right? Like, they're doing a job and you're paying them money. I think the wider questions around that is, are they being paid enough? And, you know, are they seeing any of the upside of the huge revenues flowing out of AI on the other side? And, you know, the kinds of companies that they're labeling data for are Tesla, Meta, you know, Instagram, Facebook, OpenAI, for a while had a project going with them to label the outputs of ChatGPT for toxicity. You know, all of the major car companies, some of the really biggest corporations in the world. And I spoke to a lawyer in Nairobi who's fighting on behalf of one of, you know, some of these workers. And she was saying, you know, this is there's no magic in AI. It's no different to any other industry. And she was comparing this in a way to the sort of shoe factories for Gucci and so on, where they have no idea if you're making a shoe in a factory in Bangladesh that the shoe is being sold for $3,000 or $4,000 somewhere else, and you never see the upside. And the whole point of digital work is to try and change that, right? Like that you can distribute it equally, because you can have a computer wherever you are, and it shouldn't matter whether you're in Syria or San Francisco. So I think that for me, that was the nuance that I was trying to push. It's not like, oh my God, we went to Kenya and paid people minimum wage. It's not as easy as that. Their lives are better. But that doesn't mean that like the work is finished.
It's also kind of interesting because, I mean, the title of the book is obviously code dependent, but you could also say it could be renamed codependent in some ways, because yes, we increasingly depend on these systems for various things, but also these systems depend on these very humans, these people who support them, upkeep them, maintain them, not just a couple of coders, but also people who do that sort of data labeling, data annotation, toxicity training, etc. There's one line that really struck me in the book, which I think it was from a lawyer who was sort of defending women who'd become the victim of deepfake porn. And she said, tech is such an intensely profit-driven industry that has never budgeted for legal liabilities. And it kind of made me think, because one could go further and say, well, tech doesn't really care about any kind of externality at the moment when it comes to AI. It doesn't really care about energy, water consumption, doesn't really care about the legal issues. It doesn't care about adverse effects. I mean, they do to some extent, and they also can't really afford to care too much because there's so much money involved, and the big investments somehow have to be won back. So one could say AI has to work no matter the cost, and you kind of show the cost so well. What do you think could be done to push back against this? Because there are stories in your book where people sort of resist these systems, where they try in their own small ways to fight back against basically companies sort of profiting off their labor, and also fight systems which sometimes very unfairly sort of classify them and put them into boxes.
Yeah, so I definitely don't believe there's nothing we can do, and this is the end of the road. Yes, it's true, there is concentration of power, there is a huge imbalance of knowledge as well, which is power too, and data, which is also a form of power. And one of the threads in my book is this idea that Nick Caldry and Ulysses Mejias had, which is data colonialism or digital colonialism, where you're building these systems in one small corner of the world, but they're being built using data taken from all over the world, from all of us here, from the global south, and often those people aren't seeing the benefits of the technology that's being built. But while that's true, I don't think that means that this is our future. I don't believe that at all. And so this ranges from the individual to the collective in terms of what we can do about it. And I don't know that it's necessarily like corporations don't care. It's that they are maximized for a certain objective, which is profit, and that they're responsible to their shareholders or their investors, and therefore their incentives are, I don't know if we call it misaligned, probably, if we're thinking about people people in the climate change space, or civic activists or human rights activists, misaligned or just completely different to what many of us come in with, right? Which is why they can't be the only ones to make all the decisions. So it's not that they don't care, it's that we all need to play a role. And it's not just that we can, it's that we need to. And so on the individual level, this is what the stories in my book are about, where people are. So my chapter on the Uber Eats courier in Pittsburgh. So Armin Sami, he's based in Pittsburgh now. He's from California. He was a computer scientist, but he decided to be an Uber Eats courier for a while. But it's such a fascinating story because he discovered through his work doing deliveries that he was being underpaid. And this seems like an easy thing, but it's really hard to do because Uber and other sort of gig work apps don't actually explain exactly the calculations that go into what you're being paid and why. You just get told what distance you've traveled and therefore what you're being paid. And there are all these variables that feed into the algorithm that decide what you get paid, right? But what he realized is the actual distance that he was being told he had ridden was just wildly off. So that was almost like his way into the algorithm to try and figure out sort of well, it says I've only ridden 2 miles, but I know for a fact I've done 5. And so he built this browser add-on, which allowed anybody to just plug in the picture of their receipt, and it was managing to take out their GPS coordinates, figure out how far they'd actually ridden, and then say, oh, you've actually done these many miles. And people all over the world used this app and found, I think on average, it was something like 17% of people were gig workers on Uber Eats were being underpaid on average, like just randomly.
Very low pay already.
Yeah, and without any reason or without even knowing, right? Because you're just accepting what you're given. And so for him, creating this tool was a way to look behind the curtain and to give people agency. And there's so many interesting examples of global gig workers around the world, in Indonesia, in Nairobi, in Argentina, that I spoke to, who found ways to get around the algorithm, who in one case, they all kind of swap tips and tricks about like how to make sure that you get more deliveries in a certain area, or how to like reject really terrible ones that are going to be super low tips or things like that. They kind of share and collectively pool their knowledge, and these are all really human ways of kind of resisting, and that's what we still have, right? So there's the individual ways in which we can kind of share knowledge about algorithmic systems, fight back against it, build tools in whatever way we can to be more transparent. But of course, we also have, the tools of regulation and policy. And, I think now we're, the AI Act in the EU is the kind of first example of this. The White House is looking at the executive orders, looking at kind of how you regulate AI. And companies do care, that there's a reason they're putting so much money into their lobbyists and sending people into Brussels and so on, because they are, they do care about regulation, because ultimately they will have to comply with laws. So that is another very strong tool as well. And of course, civil society is the other, us, the public, to kind of talk loudly about what matters to us, where we want to use these, but also where we don't think these systems should play a role, like where should facial recognition be used and so on. We all have a voice. So I definitely think, this is not, there's no sort of just like one single outcome for this.
It's kind of nice to know that we sort of have agency in all of this, and it's kind of also a good transition to the final theme before we go into the Q&A with you all. It's basically, I mean, the sort of big theme in there, and thing we sort of alluded to when we advertised this, was the question of what makes us human in comparison to these systems, where you've got cold, hard, seemingly objective technology on the one side, and then intuitive lived experience and autonomy of humans on the other. And in many ways, what I found is it's sort of beautifully illustrated by one of the protagonists in your book, Ashita, who's a doctor in India. And you interviewed her, and she basically uses AI to help her patients get quicker and better diagnosis, actually quite successfully. But she also observes of the technology, as you write. What makes the best doctors effective is how they relate to patients and win their confidences. Sometimes that means sacrificing your academic knowledge at the altar of a patient's well-being. And you go on to write that her goal was to practice with intuition and empathy, aware of her own fallibility, and that this is, as she sees it, sort of a different kind of intelligence, which ultimately allows her and the best doctors to operate within sort of constraints where you actually have to deal with a multitude of complex and unique human bodies. So basically something that's very hard to code into technology, which is quite important to a craft where, yes, technology can help. There's also this human element. So how would you sort of answer this question broadly based on your reporting? What does it mean to be human in the age of AI? What is the thing we sort of have that any kind of technology will never have?
Yeah, so I mean, I think about this a lot, and I'm asked it, and I think it would be easy to be like, AI will never do this. But I don't think that's a truthful answer, because at this point I don't know specifically what AI can never do. And we might be able to say, well, for sure AI will never be human. That's for sure, right? It might do a lot of things that we can do, but it will never have our lived experiences. But I think for me, the sort of learnings from this was, for a long time there were things that we thought was the domain of humans, like creativity, for example. Like, oh, we'll never have a machine that can write a story that will move us, or make a beautiful painting, or solve problems in a creative way. And none of that is true anymore as of like a year ago. So
even for journalists.
even for journalists, and it remains to be seen, obviously, if it can write like a magnum opus that's going to go down in history that will truly move us, but it can do a lot of intermediate steps, right? So for me, I think part of being human now is to try and figure out, like, what is it that we do that's different? That is part of our common goal. Like, okay, fine, so AI can help us, aid us in creativity. So what can I do then that it can help me do better? What do I want to do that I couldn't already do that AI can help me to get to? So it's trying to not to just use it to replace things that we do, but try and figure out how can it complement what I still love to do. And the other thing is, what do we still want to continue doing, right? Because the sort of way this is moving is AI will take on a lot of the boring tasks, then it will take on slightly more complex tasks. And does this mean ultimately we'll all just be hanging out on the beach and, AI will be doing all the work and we'll just have universal income and everything will be great? Is that what we want? I don't know. I think we need to figure out which parts of work do we love doing? What do we like? What do we want to keep doing? And then we decide that we don't use AI to do that. And that can be an active choice rather than a sort of conflict about us versus it kind of thing. So I think that's part of the work. And just to kind of close out, I was in Brussels. I just came from there this morning, and it was this fascinating event yesterday that the Nobel Foundation had put on. And it's really different world for me because I usually move in tech circles or journalist circles, and there were these amazing like Nobel laureates there who for peace, for biology, for chemistry, as well as a whole host of civil society participants from Luminate and like kind of really interesting organizations from across Europe. And the theme was around AI, democracy, and the media, and kind of the role of trust in all of this. But one of the people there was Alexandra Masenchuk, I think her surname is, but she's Ukrainian human rights lawyer, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. And she was, we were talking about sort of the role of technology and AI and where humans fit in, and she was talking about kind of in Kiev, where she lives now, where you see human beings helping, doing things, even putting their own lives on the line in danger for people they've literally never met in their lives before, don't know who they are. And for me, it was in contrast with, these online tribes that we have, where we just all seem to identify with our own tribe and find it so difficult to even understand what somebody on the other side of the political spectrum is thinking. And this, where it's like, I don't even know you from Adam, but I will run out and save your child in the middle of like, rubble and falling bombs. And this is, her life. And she said, that's when you look around you and you see that happening, that's when you recognize what it means to be human. That's what it is. And that, I think, will continue to be the case. And especially in the most testing times and circumstances, where we are just going to turn to each other. So I'm just really hopeful that this still exists. And I don't know if that has anything to do with AI, but for me, that's what it
It's either way, it's a glorious way to end and go into the Q&A. So the way we will do this is we will take a question from the room and then online and then back to the room. So let's start with people in the room. Who do we have? Hands up. Any more takers? If not, it goes to Eduardo. Probably have to do my microphone.
Thank you so much, Felix. And thank you for your own reporting, which is really good, and we enjoy it a lot. I would like to ask, I'm Eduardo from the Reuters Institute here for the study of journalism. So I would like to ask you about your own industry. What have you learned about the future of journalism in the context of AI while reported on other industries, and how tech is changing other industries, and also with a special focus outside the English-speaking, rich world, because I think that would be perhaps a bit different. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Felix did a whole report on this, so I feel like he's the expert, really. But actually, I wrote down, really interesting question, because I read his report, which was about the impact of AI on journalism, and kind of to contrast it to my own experience. And some of the things he picked out were exactly the same themes that were coming out in my book. And for me, that was the whole point, was that you can take what's in here and apply it to any different area, right? And in the case of journalism, and I'm going to quote you here, you know, you talked about concentrating power, reinforcing existing inequalities, and this is in the media context, right? So the most wealthy, well-resourced newsrooms will, you know, probably be all right here. They're going to have to work with tech companies, already are, buying in these tools. They need to be proactive, you know, they don't want to be on the back foot. They don't want to be defensive. They want to play offense. So we have to start to learn to use these tools in order to understand how they're going to impact what we do, how they're going to change what we do. But it's going to reinforce the inequalities we already see. And you talked about, you know, non-English language, local news, the global South, you know, they're going to have to either just rely on systems that they buy in from tech companies because they don't have the money to build their own, in which case, are you then selling all your data to them? Are you going to allow tech companies to disintermediate what you do? And, you know, we've seen this movie before in journalism. You all know it. When the social media transition happened and distribution essentially became free, you know, there was a decimation of local news. And even recently, you know, BuzzFeed and Vice have recently folded up, and some of the bastions of journalism, you know, I was discussing this with one of our senior leaders at the FT. Washington Post and LA Times have let a lot of people go. And this isn't directly a consequence of AI, but that this is going to increasingly happen. And so I think there's this big fight coming, really, because in the previous wave, media companies were too slow to respond and react. And I think, are now in a position where we're basically almost completely dependent on tech companies for distribution, revenue, so many, you know, different aspects of our business. So it's existential now when AI isn't just distributing, but creating what we can do. And, you know, for me, I kind of feel like surely not everybody is just looking for answers. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that we all just have a question and want one simple answer to everything. I believe that the reason people read good journalism is to sort of broaden their view of the world and their understanding, but also to to spark and inspire their own ideas, to think about what are the dots that I can connect to my own industry or life, right? But I think at least the way that tech companies see it is like, oh, people do just sometimes, or most of the time, just want an answer. And I think that's going to be the big question. If it's just an answer you want, you know, reading a newspaper isn't it. But generative AI can give you an answer. So yeah, that's, I think, the sort of the looming question.
It's kind of in many ways what we talked about earlier. It's about emphasizing and sort of feeling a connection to someone, where it's communication, not just as you say, information seeking, but also feeling and experiencing. Brilliant. Thank you so much. I was almost going to joke that for an AI talk, we have surprisingly little questions from an online audience, but luckily there is one. So we have Dina asking, what do you see as missing or still needed in the rapidly expanding world of trust and safety?
Okay. So within the AI context, I think trust, it was coming up again and again in our discussion yesterday, because as we all know, you know, we've talked about misinformation and disinformation now for many years, but it's now even harder to distinguish real from false. And, you know, there are some technical solutions proposed to this, and I think that they are important, and that's where tech companies will play a role, right? You know, DeepMind has talked about watermarking. OpenAI as well has looked at sort of identifying content and labeling it as AI generated content, which I think is really important in the context of elections and other sort of major events, and will help to increase trust. But, you know, it is true that the trust in institutions is very low at the moment, whether it's democratic, you know, government, whether it's the media. I think it was a Reuters Institute study, or maybe a different one, which had surveyed, I think, 28 countries about trust in the media, and over half said they distrusted. Yeah, really low. And the UK was like 23% of people said they trusted the media, which is, you know, really depressing. So I think partly, you know, that there have to be technical solutions to helping people to distinguish what's real and what isn't. But also, I think we need to create ultimately a public square where people know what institutions can be trusted when there is just like this sort of tsunami of content which is real and fake all mixed together. And somebody gave the example yesterday, I think it was the Philadelphia Inquirer, 20 or 30 years ago. The way that it kind of garnered trust was it built this giant building in the middle of the city and called it the Tower of Trust. If it were only that easy, but it kind of gave it the sort of gravitas. And that it's kind of what we have with tech companies today. Why do we trust Google search over any other search? You have to build up, you have to earn that trust. And I think that's the role that we will play when things are increasingly confusing, hopefully.
Great. Can we have any more questions from the room? Okay.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have a question about how AI is now being used as this term that kind of encompasses everything. It could be an Excel spreadsheet, it could be an LLM, it could be like a discriminative model to predict cancer tumors or something. It's kind of this catch-all phrase. So out of the people you interviewed, I'm interested as to how their conception of what AI actually was, like what was this technology that they were working with, and how important kind of public education on the nature of AI is now and in the future.
Yeah, thank you. So exactly, you're totally right about this. And actually there's a bit in there, I think it's in it's in the last chapter. I met with a science fiction writer, Ted Chiang. And if you guys haven't read his short stories, like, do it. Go buy his book today. Exhalations is one of the recent collections. I mean, he writes like one book every 10 years, and they're like these perfectly formed stories about sort of language and cognition, humans and machines, and the relationship between them. So one of his short stories, got turned into the film Arrival, which I later found when I interviewed Ilya, who was one of the creators of the transformer model, which is now the basis of all large language models, that he was inspired by Arrival when he designed the transformer. So it's like full circle. And when I told Ted Chiang about that, he just really didn't like that, the idea that he had inspired large language models. But, fact and fiction are so interconnected. And his view was, this is just applied statistics. We call it artificial intelligence. It was a misnomer from the 1950s, and it's really just statistics. And it's true that now with generative AI, people also can't kind of distinguish. So my book is actually not at all about generative AI. All of the systems in it are decision-making systems, or there deepfakes is one part of it, which are generative in nature. But I found it hard as well to kind of club them all under this one thing. So I had to kind of resort to things like data-driven predictive technologies and things like that. But a lot of the people in my book, because they're not computer scientists like Carl or people building this stuff, they're, just ordinary citizens, didn't even know they were being impacted or had encountered an AI system. That's the level of opacity that exists. So when it comes to sort of public, so the family in Amsterdam, they had no idea that their children were on a list of future criminals because some algorithm had calculated that they would be on there. And when they found out, they were just like, sorry, what? And also, how do I get out of this system? And why is my child on there? And, it's just so confusing to people to even know that an algorithm has been involved. So that's the first thing, is to, like, I think it's so important that there's awareness of the fact that there is a mathematical or a statistical system that has had a hand to play, and that there is an alternative, or at least some way for people to interrogate and understand why. And that this is the reason for a lot of the harms that play out, because people don't have anybody to go to say, get me out of this loop, right? And so that's one part of the education. And then now, the next step is understanding really what AI is and how it works. And I think generative AI has made that really urgent, because we're now directly communicating with language models and AI systems. We're interrogating them ourselves using conversation and language. And then because they respond in a way that's so human, which is using our own language back to us, we kind of believe what they say, or we use the same rubrics to judge what they're saying as we do when we talk to each other. So I've seen so many really smart people ask a language model, you know, what was told to you, or why did you do this? And it gives an answer. And then it's like, oh my God, look, this is what Google's model has said. Therefore, it must be true. It's like, no, but it's still a predictive model that's just doing, like, you know, the way you guys know how this works, right? This is like looking at a huge volume of data and doing next word predictions, obviously more powerful than that, but it doesn't mean that everything it says it's true, far from it, right? So I think it's really important for us all to be educated on fabrications that come out of these models, that things that they say could be totally made up, and that it's not probably ever intentional and not always political, like in the case of this whole Gemini situation. Like, yes, maybe there was some over-tuning there and overcompensating, but it doesn't mean that like this model is a left-wing model versus this one is, you know, the opposite. Like there are so many technical nuances there. So I think I think the next stage of it will be educate all the way down to our children to understand you can't rely on this. This isn't fact. It's not the same as a search engine or a book or an encyclopedia or a journalist or an academic who spent a decade or more researching something and has knowledge. This is different. You know, it can make up stuff and it can still be useful, but you have to know how and when to use it. And I think that's going to be key.
Okay, in absence of any online questions, anyone else in the room?
Just a kind of applied question. And it feels to me like coming from the US, I've encountered more and more cameras in kind of a cybernetic space than I ever anticipated. And a lot of it has to do with owning a car. So your license plate is just constantly photographed. And then that's correlated with your address. And if the system thinks you've transgressed, they let you know about it. And it's increasingly through private companies. This, of course, outrages my sense of freedom. And I've objected and I've won. So the system, more than once, is flawed. And yet we're all under this intense surveillance. I just wondered, you know, since you live in the UK and experience this stuff and write about it, what your thoughts are about a society that's becoming so dependent on this and a population that's increasingly surveilled and may or may not know the extent of it.
Yeah, no, that's I actually spent an entire year, I don't know how the FT let me do that, just writing about facial recognition pretty much 2019, because you know, I had come back from maternity leave and basically I actually met the owner of Gordon's Wine Bar in the Embankment, really random, at some police event. And he told me that he'd installed facial recognition cameras throughout Gordon's Wine Bar because his friends had been pickpocketed in his bar and he was really embarrassed. And he wanted to not have it happen again. So he got these cameras and then he founded an entire company, which was basically around creating facial recognition algorithms where you had a watch list of people that you could identify and private companies could essentially deploy this. And he was really excited about this. And he's now they use his system in Brazil to find pickpockets and thieves in big shopping centers, and it's sort of like all over the world. So that kind of sent me down this.
Escalated quickly there.
Yeah, I know. This is how I felt in these drinks. And so I started like following this further and seeing that, yeah, it's very much, you know, there's so many cameras in private spaces and they're not, you know, in some cases working with the police, but often just sort of their own watch lists of people. And of course, there wasn't in 2019 really any legal regulatory guidance. And that's also what eventually led me to breaking the story about King's Cross, and which is owned by a company, that the whole area by Argent, the property developer, and they deployed facial recognition cameras without anybody's knowledge or consent throughout King's Cross, looking for criminals, which was defined by them and the Met Police together, but which nobody else who was walking around in King's Cross knew about. And so I wrote that story, and you know, there was this response and reaction to it. And so I have a chapter in my book about this, where there were so many people, students at Central St. Martin's, which is right there, for example, who just felt so violated by the fact that they were being watched in a space that was meant to be public. And so I think it's really fascinating. Like for me, it's about how is this going to change our behavior when we all come to accept that this has happened, that we are being watched, and not just watched, but that it can be connected back to our identity. So yeah, that I've explored that kind of throughout this chapter, because there's crazy examples of, people who've been identified completely out of context and parts of their past uncovered through these systems, which you would never expect in public life. So for me, that's a fear, is that, the fabric of society just changes when we all know that we're being watched, and therefore change what we can express publicly because of it. And there has been a bunch of, since then, discussion and debate around, court cases in Wales and elsewhere, and, lobbying to regulate, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite from governments, because it is, widespread globally now, Uganda, India, of course, China, like, there's so many countries that I write about where this has happened, Kenya, and actually surveillance is being exported as a business out of China and elsewhere to other countries as part of like the digital Silk Road. And the culmination of this is my final chapter, which was the Chinese human rights activist I talked about, is, Xinjiang and the Uyghur state, where the entire state is continually surveilled in order to identify people who can be put into camps.
Okay, because we've probably got time for maybe two more questions. One more question. Okay. Maybe I can combine the two of them. So you ask a question, and I'll go to you.
Okay. Just a quick one. How do you or your colleagues at the FT use AI now? Thanks.
Okay, so one, and I'll to you.
It's a bit longer.
Shall I go first?
Right.
It's quite a short answer.
Okay.
You want
go
me to
for it.
answer first? I mean, I personally don't. I don't use it in any way to write or report anything that I do, and I don't think really any journalists do. At the FT, we're looking at using it for, so we're already using it in content moderation. So we get lots of comments, and instead of having, so we have really great moderators, but rather than them looking at every single thing, the AI can flag up certain things that allows them to then go on and actually facilitate discussion rather than just saying yes and no. So it's made that a much richer discussion. And I think we'll be looking at it in areas like better search of our own previous work, to be able to answer sort of questions based on our historical, articles and archives, things like that. I think I'm increasingly interested in Perplexity, which is like sort of an alternate search. It's not, it's not Google, but it's really useful for certain types of questions, like who is this person and what do I need to know about them? And it gives you citations of where they've got that from. So I'm finding that it's like actually a really good addition to search.
Yeah, sure. So my question is, I mean, you alluded to it in the talk, but with things like watermarks and whatnot, but like, I think it's fair to say that most of the people in the room and the people online have a larger interest or understanding of AI than potentially the background population. Whilst we might be able to sort of look at what, a year ago was Will Smith eating meatballs and is now like a puppy that has another one coming out of its belly or something, but we can tell that to be what it is. But I do worry about the rest of the background population, or people that aren't as engaged or up to speed with the trends that are happening. And I was wondering, as you as a journalist, if you have spoken to anybody that's working within those sort of companies that like Facebook and Meta, all of them, to understand exactly how they are approaching what could be some quite troubling content on their site that the vast majority of the users simply won't know what it is. And
you mean AI generated?
Yeah, AI generated content, if it's sort of publisher or if it's algorithm,
So I would say the main effort that I've heard from talking to many companies is creating a system of identification so I think images, video, audio, but also text. So OpenAI did have sort of an identifier system. It was like last year for text, for ChatGPT generated text, but they did a report that said it was only correct 20% of the time, and then it sort of disappeared off their website. So, you know, not that useful. But, you know, they will be working actively on trying to find AI generated patterns. And I think for them, that will be the key to getting people educated around, you know, this is AI and this is not. I'm not sure that's enough. As you say, I think if you're not following the news, you still need a way to kind of learn to be skeptical of what you do. And it's not even, you know, just even people in the room, I think, could be taken in because the technology is just getting so much better. So I think we all need to find a way to be more skeptical.
And a good place to start is actually Marla's book. And yeah, with that, unfortunately, we have to bring it to a close. Thank you so much for all your questions. Thanks so much for being here. Big round of applause to Madhu.